Shahid Buttar, who is running against, as I call her, Gas Queen, Nancy Pelosi. Thank you so much for coming back. We really appreciate it.
It's great to be with you, Joy. Yeah, glad to be here.
Thank you. So, the one thing that when I had you on before with the it was a debate between the three people running against Pelosi, and the first thing that jumped out at me is the fact that you are an activist. To me, activists make the best politicians, lack of a better term, because you guys have that foundation. So do you just kind of want to touch on how you got started into being, an activist and then wanting to get into things like this?
Sure. For me, my activism to some extent was forced on me around not having an opportunity to go to college the first time I went. My family lost our home to foreclosure, found myself unable to finish school. So that really forced me into a posture of being very critical, at least, of our established institutions. The way I got through college was going through night school for the better part of a decade. And while I was there, the battle for Seattle happened. I was working for a series of Wall Street firms in Chicago, basically peddling some of the precursors to the 2008 financial crisis. And I recall watching on Bloomberg terminals, of all things, which are interesting to reflect upon as a historical phenomenon in the wake of subsequent events, reading about this up-to-the-minute reports of this street fight over corporate trade agreements and globalization happening in Seattle. And that was right as I was finishing undergrad. I had a chance to go to Stanford for law school right after that. And while I was there, the war drum started beating for what became Bush's war in Iraq. And so it was organizing in response to Bush's war drums and in the wake of the surveillance state that he had forced on the country at the time. So as a Muslim immigrant in the wake of that era, my activism really was forced on me. The constitutional crisis was a thing that I could have turned a blind eye to, I suppose, but it certainly didn't turn a blind eye to me. And I like to say sometimes I'm like, and many Muslims in America are like canaries in the coal mine of the United States. And having been a constitutional canary, I'm eager to issue that warning to my neighbors about how to avoid the slide into authoritarianism that I have feared for the last 20 years. And given how, maybe another thing I'd say just to your question about my activism, for me, I've just tried to do what needs to get done, and to go where I'm needed. And so at the time it was responding to the surveillance state and the war in Iraq. I had a chance to, was one of the first advocates for marriage equality in the courts. And I would say at the same time, I'm an activist. I'm also an impact litigator and have led nonprofits and briefed Congress at the invitation of multiple members. And all of those invitations have come about as a combination of organizing, writing, and advocating. And I've had a chance to do that around marriage equality, around privacy, around due process in the face of state violence, human rights in the face of torture, any number of economic rights, environmental sustainability. My gigs have juggled everything from preparing a pipeline of progressive jurists for Democratic presidents to consider, to fighting the FBI in multiple occasions across 15 years, to fighting telecom companies for net neutrality. And I've had a chance to do a lot of different things over the years. And I'm eager to continue doing that for my neighbors. Absolutely. And hopefully constituents in Congress.
Absolutely. So you did run last time, but there were more, people in the field, everything like that. This time, I just want to give the viewers an update in case they aren't in California. The way that it works is it's what they refer to as a jungle primary. So the people with the top 2 votes, it could be any party, are the ones who go to the general. And that came down to Nancy and Shahid. So it's them. There is no Republican besides Nancy. It's just one of the two. She'll either stay or you'll go in.
I like how you put that. There's no Republican other than Nancy. She's the only Republican in the race. That's right.
Exactly. Yeah. She's a Republican with a D. Jackie Fox and Friends says, "I'm proud of you for stepping up." So that was to you.
To you as well. You're stepping up. That's very kind. I appreciate that.
So, one of the things about, going up against such a powerhouse, I mean, she's an incumbent of a really long time. And she is like this public figure that almost has been untouchable in so many ways. Many people were even too scared to run against her. So when did you decide, what? Granted, I'm not super well known and, this is going to be grassroots, but screw it. I am going to take her on.
Yeah, it was February 2018, and I was working at the Electronic Frontier Foundation at the time, and I watched Nancy Pelosi undermine a proposed surveillance reform, not for the first time. She's been an architect of the surveillance state, and at every corner, every opportunity to stand with authoritarian executive secrecy and civil liberties violations, Nancy Pelosi has done that, stood on the side of the executive branch instead of the American people, and on the side of the agencies, namely the FBI, CIA, NSA, CBP, ICE, I could go on, instead of the constitutional rights that she swore an oath to protect. And so this was February 2018. It was a few weeks after that she did this stunt. She filibustered. She read for 8 hours on the House floor letters from DREAM Act students, while at the very same time undermining immigrant rights in a congressional negotiation. And watching her for the 50,000th time settle for theatrical performative acts of governance instead of actually casting the hard votes. I've gnashed my teeth at her representation of my city for so long. And, it basically got to the point where my sense of political self-preservation was eclipsed by my sense of political frustration. And I've long been tired of San Francisco being represented by a relative conservative in Washington, particularly a relative conservative who claims to be a liberal. There's nothing liberal about embracing mass surveillance. There's nothing liberal about cementing executive secrecy and enforcing it across a progressive caucus. There's nothing liberal about signing Trump's budget for unprecedented military expenditures. There's nothing liberal about giving him $5 billion to create concentration camps on the border. There's nothing liberal about Nancy Pelosi. And this is a proudly liberal, progressive, visionary town. And, I've felt this frustration for 20 years when she was helping carry Bush's water in, the continuing cover up over CIA torture, or protecting him from impeachment, or enabling his wars for profit. I saw Nancy Pelosi undermine our city's long established legacy and consensus at the time. And, I've long wanted someone to take the seat, and I basically grew tired of waiting for somebody to do it. And knowing that, having led nonprofits, I know how to speak to media and formulate a policy and coach a staff and do all of the ingredients that go into running a campaign. It got increasingly hard for me to justify not doing it. I felt very strongly that it needs to happen. I grew tired of waiting for someone else to do it. And, to the extent you want something done right, if other people aren't willing to do it, you do it yourself. And I'm very grateful for the tens of thousands of people across the country and from every neighborhood here in San Francisco who've emerged and to rally around us. It's very humbling as an immigrant to have this opportunity to vindicate our nation's principles.
Absolutely. And I kind of digress, but as an immigrant and a Muslim, how does it make you feel when Nancy, say her behavior to Ilhan Omar? How is that, how is watching that? Because I know so many of us were just absolutely repulsed.
That's one example. I'd also note her behavior towards Trump as equally outrageous for different reasons. Towards Ilhan Omar, she's punching down and opening the door for demagogues, namely Trump. And with Trump, she'll see fit to fat shame him, to body shame him, but she won't see fit to challenge his policies, right? And if you're going to punch up. Don't punch down. Ilhan Omar is a refugee to this country. She's the first voice in Congress who's actually been willing to ask hard questions about U.S. complicity in human rights abuses of rights that we fought a world war to establish in the first place. It is profoundly patriotic, I dare say, to defend civil liberties, particularly at this moment in history, against a criminal president who knows no respect for the rule of law. And it is her unwillingness to do that drives me to challenge Nancy Pelosi. I see Nancy Pelosi directing her fire. She has a great deal of influence in Washington. And instead of using it to stop Trump's foreign policy, to stop Trump's fiscal policy, to stop Trump's war on the Constitution, she's facilitating all those things. And the target that she chooses to attack is a person of color refugee in Congress who's trying to defend human rights. And that to me is very revealing of the speaker's priorities. And I'm conscious of running to represent the city where the United Nations was founded, here in San Francisco. This is a city that has long favored human rights in across contexts. We're a sanctuary city. We protect the rights of immigrants, but our voice in Congress doesn't. And our voice in Congress refuses to show up for our city. It's been 20 years. She's been in Congress for 30. And for 20 of those years, she's been in party leadership and particularly dismissive of the city's needs and interests. One example of this, I just to throw out as an example, an off-duty FBI agent shot one of my neighbors, an unhoused person, about 200 feet from my front door about 2 months ago. And I got home that night and I was speaking to some of my neighbors who said what had happened. And I went to a series of community meetings over the next 2 weeks. The first one was convened by a nonprofit in the neighborhood, and it was kind of like a grieving session where people had a chance to share their feelings. Thankfully, the young man survived, but everybody in his community felt very unsafe. They're unhoused. And if an agent of the state can just roll up at any given point in time, not identify themselves, shoot you, and then hide behind federal authority and answer no questions to anyone about it, there's a problem here. The second meeting was local authorities, including our district attorney, the police department, members of the board of supervisors, and they all said, this is jacked up, totally unacceptable, big problems here. And we're local officials. That was a federal actor. There is not anything at all that we can do about it. There's one person in this city with any opportunity to ask questions like, why is the FBI in this neighborhood in the first place? Is this person being investigated? Will there be any accountability? Those are important questions. There's only one person who can ask it. Her name is Nancy Pelosi, and she said not a word in public. The third meeting, our campaign organized with DSA and with Cop Watch, and it was the only meeting to my knowledge where the victim's family was heard publicly. They FaceTimed him in from his hospital bed, and he addressed the group directly. And everybody walked out of that meeting, signed up for counter surveillance shifts of the SFPD with Cop Watch. And that's the kind of show up for the community that I offer and that our campaign offers. I've been fighting the FBI for 15 years. I think it's profoundly ironic, frankly, that this happened. And I think it's revealing that the Speaker of the House, despite having all the influence in Congress, has other things on which to focus and can't show up or has seen fit not to show up for these issues. And San Francisco deserves a voice in Congress, and I dare say Congress needs San Francisco's voice to be represented in the body.
Wow, I can't say I'm shocked, but that's really egregious. Well, thank you for being there for them, because I can't even fathom. So do you find that those things happen a lot, where things go on locally in your district and she's just kind of MIA and you have to step in?
Entirely, yeah. I mean, I would say the same thing. Hunters Point is an example. Sometimes another version of this, I'll get asked by people occasionally, you're running against the most powerful member of Congress. San Francisco's got a powerful voice. She can bring home pork. You're going to enter if you're so lucky to win the election as a junior member. Like, why should we trade someone with so much influence for you? And I point to Hunters Point. Hunters Point is a neighborhood in the southeast corner of the city. It's one of the last remaining African-American enclaves in San Francisco. And the Navy has poisoned it for 50 years. Radiation poisoning. It's toxic neighborhood. It's been declared a Superfund site. There have been billions of federal dollars procured for a corporate cleanup that has been found to be fraudulent. They falsified the soil samples while all this was going on. And it would be great if Hunters Point had a powerful member of Congress, or maybe any member of Congress, who would show up to ask the questions of the Navy and of the federal agencies and the corporate contractors to ensure some validity in the cleanup, to make sure that this neighborhood, which incidentally has cancer rates and asthma rates predictably vastly beyond the city's baseline. Some of the public health indicators in this neighborhood are among the worst in the world, particularly breast cancer rates. And it's preposterous. And Nancy Pelosi represents this area. She is the one person, just like we were talking about in the case of the FBI shooting, who could do something about it. If not through legislation, oversight. If not oversight, constituent services. She could do, there's lots of opportunities for a member of Congress. You write the letter to the agency at least to get them to explain what happened, right? She's never done that. And it's revealing to me, again, that she is much more interested in promoting her perceived interests of the Democratic Party than she is in promoting the needs and interests of the district that she represents. And, just so that I'm not being too charitable there, her perceived interests of the Democratic Party are also inaccurately construed and confused. And I could talk about that separately, but you're absolutely right. It has long been the case that Nancy Pelosi abandoned San Francisco for Washington. And she is a voice ultimately for Wall Street in Washington. And that's exactly why I'm running to replace her.
So, yeah, I mean, given that she is, the epitome of a Wall Street candidate, the fact that you are not taking big money, of course, your platform's, 180 difference, but
yeah.
Do you think that that's probably one of the biggest differences, is that you're totally people powered?
That's certainly one of them. I mean, right. We are 100% people powered, and she's a corporate candidate. I think the fact that I'm an immigrant with no property, and she is, born with a silver spoon in her mouth, worth over $100 million, born as a daughter of a powerful East Coast political family and the matriarch of a political dynasty. I think of that almost as she's an oligarch, and I am not. Basically, is the big difference. I'm a schmo with a pen and a 20-year history of fighting for my neighbors against the administrations of both Republicans and Democrats. That's my qualification. And her qualification is that she was a Democratic Party fundraiser. And you can see that demonstrated in our respective inclinations. There is a president, a criminal president still in office, largely because Speaker Pelosi perceives him as opportune. He's a great foil for her. She can get press appearances and she can raise money off him. I'm not interested in raising money off somebody. I'm here to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And they include both our criminal president and his corporate enablers in Congress. And, I'm not here to promote my career. If I cared about my career, I'd still be at EFF, right? That was a perfect career. I enjoyed it. It was fun, rewarding. And, there was job security. There's not a lot of job security in running against the Speaker of the House, right? So it's not my career I'm interested in. It is principle. And I am here for the future. That's what I've always cared about. It's why I do what I do. I recognize that there will be a point in time when we're all going to have to answer for our actions to my nieces and nephews, if no one else, for me. And I want to be able to look them in the face and say, either, yes, I've been fighting for you since before you had a political consciousness, or, if things go off the rails, as they seem to do every day, I want to be able to tell them in all honesty and sincerity that I did everything I could. And that's why I've done everything I've done over the last 20 years. It's why I'm running for office, because I want to do everything I can. And I'm tired of frankly, I don't say it very much, but I often feel I told you so. We warned about the crisis in civil liberties and how it would defund social services in 2003 when Bush was going to war. Now they tell us we don't have money for Medicare for all. Thank you very much. No, of course we have money for Medicare for all, but they just wasted it on bombs and missiles for the last 20 years to no seemingly productive end. And, I'm tired of watching us step into pitfalls, and I'd like to have a chance to do what I can to keep us from repeating those errors going forward.
You had to have dealt with this. I know you have. The only pushback, you have so many supporters, and the only time I get pushback when I promote you is, I don't want to replace a woman. So I know you've got to hear that. I know you've got to get that sexist, identity politic crap. So what is your response when people say, I really like you, but
yeah,
how do you respond to that?
I just make the point that marginalization is intersectional. And it is certainly true that women have been historically marginalized in this country. And I acknowledge that. I also acknowledge that immigrants and people with no property are also marginalized. And as a very, very wealthy, very privileged white woman, compared to an immigrant with no property whose family lost our home to foreclosure when I was 16 and who fought my way through undergrad night school for 10 years before I had a chance to then teach at Stanford Law School before graduating, to then fight Nancy Pelosi for 20 years to vindicate my city's interests. If she wants to compete for marginalization, I'm very happy to do that. And, if there is an underdog here, it is certainly me. And the idea that she is a powerful woman, I do want to give credit where it's due. She's done amazing things for representation of women in leadership. And that is not enough. Gina Haspel's a woman who leads the CIA. She's also an international criminal, right? I don't think it's any better when the conservatives are women. I'm not interested in identity as a marker for representation. I'm interested in interests, ideology, and votes as a marker of representation. If Nancy Pelosi wants to represent San Francisco as a self-described liberal, it's not enough to be a woman. She actually has to vote against Trump's concentration camps. She has to vote against his military budget. She has to oppose his criminal, murderous foreign policy. She does none of those things. She marches in lockstep with him at every opportunity while claiming so-called resistance based on photo ops. And that is not enough by a long shot, not at a moment in time like this. And I dare say that an immigrant Muslim, I dare say, in this moment in time is particularly qualified. I have more skin in the game than a wealthy landlord, right? I'm going to have to deal with the consequences of Nancy Pelosi's decisions. She is not. And the future is going to have to deal with the consequences of her decisions, and she is not, right? There is a generational change happening. We've seen it already begin in Congress with the emergence of the squad. I'm here to expand the squad. I'm here to defend the future. And, you know, a thing that people forget, the future is inexorable. You can't stop it. And to that extent, it's just a matter of time before our movement finds the representation in the halls of Congress that we're entitled to. And I'm eager to make that happen as soon as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam, who's a part of our RP, he said, there you go. This is what political integrity sounds like.
Oh, that's kind.
So you've got some fans.
I see the comment there. That is really kind.
What you're saying is so right on. And, I usually don't get into age because Bernie's 78, but Nancy is 80. So, how long do people think she's gonna keep going?
Yeah.
Do you think she'll continue to run?
I certainly hope not. I mean, I plan to end her career, and it would be silly for her to try to get the seat back after I take it from her. And, as much as I could prognosticate about the hypothetical future that she retains the seat, I don't see that future emerging. She did do quite well in the primary, but reality is endorsing the future with every passing day. There's a pandemic, which is proving with every day in very stark terms that her commitment to for-profit healthcare is killing people en masse, not just the idiocy of a criminal president who knows no concern for governance. That's a big part of why tens of thousands of Americans are dying. And so is the corporate deference of the Democratic Party to the interests, for instance, of health insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies. To that extent, as the pandemic unfolds and the crisis unfolds and people respond to the failures of the preceding paradigm, I don't think that Pelosi has a chance of holding onto her seat. I think she could do a lot of things to try to hold on to it. In the primary, she was running Facebook ads and cable television ads for the first time in 30 years. She was showing up in the community glad handing for 30 years, incidentally inviting people to congregate outside in the early stages of what proved to be a pandemic, putting people at risk, unfortunately, though I can't frankly blame her for it because I don't think people knew at the time the circumstances. So I don't want to be opportunistic there. I just want to make the point that she hasn't represented the district. And I think the district is coming to discover that. As we get the word out, we've certainly raised more support for the campaign, and we've got more volunteers and supporters for this campaign than any campaign that's ever challenged her in 30 years. I am the first Democrat to ever reach a November election against her. And I have every intention, with the 20,000 donors and the thousands of volunteers around the country and our growing staff, of making sure that this November is her last election.
Awesome. So you do find that, I know your campaign is just blowing up. Your follower accounts, your donations. I know a lot of people, when Bernie dropped, they've been sending you the donations instead. And
very
it's
humbled
really
by that.
growing. What's that?
I was just saying I've been very grateful and humbled by that support.
Yeah, it's amazing. And so with that, and now you got another huge endorsement yesterday, which is amazing. Marianne, who's just a queen. She's freaking awesome. So I'm sure that's going to help even more. You have ridiculous people who have endorsed you, like Brother Cornell and Sean King. And it's really incredible. So all of that has got to help us, for sure. But something I've noticed when I interview candidates is they do have supporters from all across the country. But the question is, do you have a lot of support in your district who can actually vote for you? Because we all want to vote for you. But
I appreciate that.
everyone who donates wants to vote for you. But it really comes down to who's able.
That's exactly right. Congressional districts are discrete geographies. So you can, if you're lucky, establish a national base. And I'm very fortunate to have drawn the support of people from every one of the 50 states and every county in California and every city in the Bay Area and every neighborhood in San Francisco. And again, that's very humbling. And at the end of the day, we have to convince a majority of San Francisco voters to vote for us. And I'm very confident we can get there for a few different reasons. Based on the primary results, we do have to double our vote total twice to take the seat. We got 33,000 votes 2 months ago. In 2018, I got as many votes as Representative Ocasio-Cortez did in the same cycle, in the same platform for all intents and purposes. And we're back to finish the job now. And the key to getting there, from the substantial base of support that we've already secured, is particularly voter contacts. So before the pandemic, that looks like knocking on people's doors. And we were doing that with hundreds of volunteers around the Bay Area. Since the pandemic hit, it's really forced us onto the phones. And the phones, at the same time as being, less compelling an opportunity to meet people than an in-person interaction. And so it is a disadvantage in that context. There's also a silver lining there, which is to say the phones, unlike knocking on doors, are available to that national base. So the key for us in the next 5 months is flooding the phones. And so one of the things that we did in the wake of the pandemic, while we pivoted to mutual aid efforts and turned our phone banking operation to wellness checks, we were building the digital tools to scale and expand our phone banking operation. So we've trained about 500 of our volunteers so far on our phone banking tools. Anybody anywhere is welcome to jump in. People can sign up at shahid.fyi/volunteer. We host online training sessions every 48 hours and would love to plug folks in. Those calls to voters make all the difference. And if I may, you mentioned Bernie's campaign. With Bernie's campaign, those of us who are making calls for him, we put in often, thousands and thousands of phone calls. And usually we didn't have more than a few weeks to do it across an entire state. And in our race, we only have a single city to cover, and we still have 5 months left to do it. So we have the time, we have the resources, we have the people, and we have the platform to liberate this seat, which is why I'm so confident that we're going to win in November.
Absolutely. Where did that comment go? Someone wanted to know if they donate, if you'll send them a coupon. Oh, here it goes. Will you send me a voucher for a $12 pint of ice cream if I don't?
You got to go to Pelosi for that, unfortunately. Only Nancy Pelosi could do that.
And she'll totally fat shame you when you eat it. So.
I can't afford $12 pints of ice cream, just to be clear.
So one of the biggest differences to me is, she basically shelved Medicare for all, and she's a staunch defender of PAYGO. So what is your take on that? Why do you support Medicare for all, and why do you oppose the way she's trying to go about it?
Yeah, thank you for raising those questions, and they're really important ones. Healthcare should be a human right, and I'll go further than that. Any basic human need should be treated like a human right. I include in that calculus shelter, housing, healthcare, education, food, all of those we should treat as human rights. Instead, we treat them as objects of exchange, opportunities for someone to get rich. That's the market mechanism that treats people like expendable resources in the service of accumulating capital. And I'm very eager to put people before capital. Capitalism is the derogation of humanity in the service of capital accumulation. Humanism is placing capital in its appropriate place as an opportunity for exchange, but not a driver of the outcomes that people are subjected to. When we think about Medicare for all in particular and universal healthcare, it is absolutely horrific to me that we treat illness as an excuse to bleed people dry of every ounce they've ever saved, force them into bankruptcy, and then homelessness. That is the trajectory for Americans if you don't have a family to fall back on. That is the track. Doctors will talk in palliative care often about the spend down to Medicaid. which is basically what happens to people. If you get cancer, something like half of cancer patients end up losing their life savings to respond to the existential threat of, this is life-saving treatment we're talking about. And when people, it's a similar dynamic here. This will sound disjointed, but follow me, between healthcare and national security, where people will pay anything because they are perceived existential needs. And it is precisely for that reason that they shouldn't be objects of exchange, because you can't get rational pricing in a market where anybody will pay for any amount for the good. That's why we have drugs and pharmaceuticals being priced through the roof in completely inaccessible ways. Think about insulin, right? Insulin costs pennies to manufacture relative to what it's sold for. It is a life-saving medication for people. Why do we put corporate profits before the lives of people with diabetes? It's very revealing to me, and it's entirely unacceptable. I sometimes say that I would say it's barbaric, except that I think that demeans barbarians, who I think in those civilizations did practice more care for each other than we in the United States do for each other. And I see universal healthcare, frankly, as an extension of the same principles I learned about watching Mr. Rogers. And it's a no-brainer. It's simple. We have the resources. People need them. And when we don't allocate resources like healthcare according to where they're needed, we end up paying more for worse outcomes. And that's what we do right now. We pay more money for worse outcomes than any country in the world. And I don't understand why Americans accept it, frankly. I mean, it's absurd to me that we settle for getting such a bad deal. And when all it does is just fill the pockets of executives and shareholders of pharmaceutical and health insurance companies. That's a really bad trade for a civilization, to trade, people being homeless and suffering unnecessarily, people dying needlessly, especially now in a time of pandemic, just so some industries can be well rewarded. That's a really, really, really bad trade.
Absolutely. And, speaking of the pandemic, I don't think a lot of people understand the magnitude of the HEROES Act and, the legislation that Pelosi is dealing with, because she gets praised regardless. But what is your interpretation of what her last bill, the HEROES Act? What are the flaws of it?
Lots of flaws, and I would describe them particularly in the context of their omission, what it did not include. So one of the things that was proposed, Pramila Jayapal from Washington State had proposed the Paycheck Guarantee Act to make sure that people stay on payrolls, and this would help diminish the spike in unemployment claims that are, threatening to wreck the economy. Speaker Pelosi did not embrace that proposal. Another proposal that I'm very supportive of, that I've been disappointed in Nancy Pelosi's rejection of, though entirely unsurprised given her class interests, is Ilhan Omar's proposal to cancel rents and mortgages. And her bill would not only ensure that working class Americans don't need to pay for their housing costs through the pandemic, it would also provide support for small landlords so that people who might have an extra home or an extra room in their home, that they don't end up paying for it either. It's corporate landlords and banks that should be paying the costs of housing during the pandemic, particularly because we've already bailed them out more than once. And the American people have never gotten a bailout. So why are we trying to squeeze blood out of the rock of working class Americans with their backs to the wall while the economy is shut down? Speaker Pelosi is yet again proving her commitment to Wall Street before Main Street. And San Francisco is a place where, frankly, the housing costs were untenable even before the pandemic shut down the economy. And people have been struggling here around housing costs. It's been vicious. I've served in Washington twice for 2 5-year stints each, for 5 years each on 2 different occasions. And each time that I came back to San Francisco after going to our nation's capital to fight the right wing, I discovered that there had been mass displacement. And I knew the whole time because I was coming back here to visit, but the gentrification that's happened in San Francisco has changed the composition of the city quite dramatically. We have an African-American mayor, and I'm thankful for that representation in City Hall. At the same time, the African-American community in our city is down to something like 3 to 4% of the population, which is like a lot lower than it used to be. And the changing face of San Francisco reflects the untenability of the housing market. Now, just to make this sharp, Nancy Pelosi is a very wealthy landlord. She makes $1 million a year from rental income, and that might be why she doesn't support the proposal to cancel rents and mortgages. How much different might this crisis look like for working American families, not just here in San Francisco, but across the country, if the Democrats weren't led by, just like Trump, a wealthy landlord who inherited lots of money, who is from a social class and practices in her policymaking that kind of class self-defense. And I particularly seeing that in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party should not be led by oligarchs, and it particularly should not be led by oligarchs defending plutocracy or the interest of corporate landlords. It should be led by people promoting the interest of working class Americans. And that's what Ilhan Omar's doing. That's what the Squad is doing. It's exactly what Nancy Pelosi is not doing. And it's why she needs to be replaced as San Francisco's voice in the House.
Absolutely. How did I digress a little, and I didn't have this on my thing to ask, but how did you feel when the Squad, when AOC said she was Mama Bear? Because I know all of us pretty much worked our shit.
I mean, I'm not gonna hit sideways. I see the Squad as people who I want to join and empower, and I might be disappointed in occasional things that they do. There are occasional moments I've been disappointed in Bernie. I didn't want to see him suspend his campaign. I wish he were still in the race. I do think we need his voice and his vision now more than ever. But I'm also not going to criticize him for his tactical decisions. I mean, I see Bernie and the Squad equally as people who've done great service to the community and our movement and our people. Bernie in making Medicare for all an object of discussion, like we're having this conversation in public, largely because he mainstreamed the idea. And before he mainstreamed the idea, he spent 50 years in Washington fighting for us. So as far as I'm concerned, I'll critique his policy positions, but I'm not going to critique his motivations. And I'm not going to say he's a sellout for anything. I don't think he's a sellout. I don't think the Squad is selling out in any way. I think they're making tactical decisions to try to preserve their space to operate on Capitol Hill. I wish they made other decisions, but I can't begrudge them those decisions. Honestly, and frankly, if I were to think about this from a movement perspective, I would rather they have unfettered space to operate on Capitol Hill than throw their lot behind me. Ultimately, they had to carve their own paths to Washington, and I and our campaign and our supporters will have to do the same. And I'm looking forward to doing that. And I'm looking forward to particularly removing one of the principal constraints impeding their voice from attaining the majority in Congress that we will once we remove more of these centrists, careerists, and replace them with voices willing to stand with working class Americans and with future generations.
And I think that actually would be a good lead into something we discussed a little before we went live. You were talking about ending the independence of the court. I'm sorry, my words got mixed, but yes. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I want very much to defend the independence of the courts by ending judicial life tenure. We're taught in traditional legal academia here in the United States that a critical, I should say, component of our constitutional design is the independence of the judiciary and the opportunity for courts, judges, to make decisions without being influenced by political pressure. Historically, we embodied that principle by accepting life tenure for judges, the idea that once you're on the bench, you never have to face election, you're there for good, and you're immune from political pressure. But what that has done is chain the future to the past. And that's bad enough in the abstract, but it's even worse when you have open rapists on the Supreme Court. Now, a lot of Americans grew alarmed about Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court in the last, since the Trump administration. I fought Brett Kavanaugh's nomination in 2006 to the DC Circuit. I've seen him come up through the ranks, and I've spent the better part of my career trying to keep people like him off the federal bench. And it is precisely because the nominations process has been politicized, it has been rendered effectively secret, and it's very lopsided because at the same time that you have Republicans weaponizing their appointments, you had Democratic presidents, I'm thinking of President Obama in particular, who did not show up in kind. I mean, the Obama administration's record on judicial nominations was profoundly disappointing, and they basically nominated progressive or diverse, let's say, prosecutors. Their idea of judicial nominations were prosecutors who were themselves people of color. So this very same tokenism that we were talking about when you were describing people, contrasting me and the figure of Nancy Pelosi as a woman, for instance, that same tokenism and symbolism over substance drove the Obama nominations. And so, there's a asymmetry there, and it long preceded Obama. President Bush and President Reagan before him, they also weaponized the courts. And President Clinton, like President Obama, did not respond in kind. So we've had 40 years of stacked, stilted judicial nominations. And remember, all of these people serve for life. President Trump has rammed through his nominees. He's appointed more than a quarter of the federal judiciary already. And if we accept judicial life tenure, we are saying that Trump's nominees for the next 2 generations should have the opportunity to decide for the rest of us the limits of our federal policy. And I'm not okay with that. Brett Kavanaugh shouldn't be on the Supreme Court in the first damn place. And I would go further than that. The Supreme Court has not been legitimately composed since the year 2000. And there's you don't have to accept my analysis for this. Bruce Ackerman is a law professor at Yale Law School. And he wrote the article at the time explaining how the court packed itself by choosing the president, who then appointed their own successors. That circularity in the court's nominations process created a fundamental illegitimacy. And the only way to restore it is to get new justices. And some people would say, if we add seats to the Supreme Court, we can pack the court in the way that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, proposed to do in a previous era. I don't like that solution for a couple of reasons. The main one is that it undermines judicial independence. It politicizes the court. It reintroduces a different locus of politics for the one that has driven it historically, but it still politicizes the institution. Ending life tenure by instituting staggered terms for Supreme Court justices. 10 years ago, I wrote the article suggesting 18-year staggered terms for Supreme Court justices. That would ensure that justices are still immune from political pressure. It would ensure that they have plenty of time to gain expertise and experience. It would ensure that the body remains becomes again independent. And it would also ensure that right-wing justices don't hold on to their seats for 40 years to effectively, operate like shackles on democracy in America. And I just say here that a lot of Democrats recognize the threat that right-wing courts present to our aims, but not a lot of Democrats are proposing solutions for it. Nancy Pelosi has certainly not proposed any solutions for it. And I'm eager in all of these different arenas, from healthcare to climate justice to racial justice, economic justice, keeping people in their homes, addressing pandemics, and stopping Trump's nominees from railroading our democracy. I'm eager to propose solutions and secure consensuses around them on all of these different issues.
Absolutely. And that's a good thing to bring up, since we keep getting voter shamed about Biden because of the courts. That's the number one thing. Think of the courts. So I'm going to keep that in mind. That's really good.
Can I say one thing there, as long as you bring up Biden and the courts? Every time I hear this a lot, think about Biden and the courts. And I have a 4-word response: Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill. I do remember the courts. And that's precisely why so many of us were worried about a Biden nomination. And the fact that people who remember Biden's record might have qualms about voting for him is a reason to consider other nominees. At this point, I understand that there's been a lot of tension across different wings of the movement. I'm even willing to say, if it's not going to be Bernie, fine, anybody but Biden. If we let Biden be the nominee, we are ducking into a buzzsaw. And I'm not going to say I'm not going to endorse him. I mean, if he shows up for Medicare for all, I'll endorse him. If he shows up for the policies that the American people want, that's the nominee that we want. He hasn't done that yet. And, setting aside his capacity challenges, his record, there's just any number of other nominees. There were 20 nominees in the presidential field, and the Democratic Party managed to coalesce around the weakest, most conservative one, who's been caught lying multiple times. I haven't even talked about Tara Reid yet, and his long documented, disrespect for women. It amazes me that Democrats have so little regard for their own principles and I would say this: it proves to me that the corporate Democratic Party, led by Nancy Pelosi, would rather lose to Trump than win with Bernie. And I think of that as also very revealing. And part of, I've seen in the wake of Bernie suspending his campaign, part of my mission, I'm not only running to liberate San Francisco's voice in the House, and I'm not only running to end the bipartisan consensus on corporate rule, I am also running to vindicate and frankly politically avenge Bernie Sanders. I see the corporate Democratic Party and what it did to him. And while I can't fight, that fight nationally, I see one architect of the corporate rule of the Democratic Party, wielding a particularly vulnerable seat representing the nation's most progressive city. And I have every intention of winning this city, my city, a more sincere representation of our voice in Congress.
Absolutely. You, unlike Nancy Pelosi, you have actually talked about Tara Reade. So you don't have to go in depth, but what are your thoughts on that? And also, how do you differ from Pelosi basically kind of basically saying, I believe him, like, period, and kind of just disregarding her?
Yeah, if I may, I just broaden the context of feminism generally, and I do want to draw a contrast here. I will claim and I will back up that I am a far more sincere representation of feminism than Nancy Pelosi. And maybe I should have said this before when you asked me about what people say about her being a woman. Tara Reade deserves to be heard, and she deserves to be taken seriously. And I've heard a lot of centrists say, well, why did this come out now after Biden was the presumptive nominee? And that it makes me roll my eyes and facepalm, because, she's been trying to get attention for her claims for decades. And because of who Biden is, she couldn't get a hearing. Powerful people should not be above the law. I was arrested in the Senate for asking a question of an Obama administration official. And at the point, I didn't mean to make this point, but one of the points it illustrated is that powerful people are above the law in this country. And that's bad enough if powerless people weren't so thoroughly victimized by it, right? But the rest of us are subjected to lethal, arbitrary so-called justice without charges or trials. When I was arrested in the Senate, I was asking about Eric Garner's death in New York, contrasted with James Clapper's impunity and public pension in reward for lying under oath to the American people in the US Senate about grave constitutional abuses en masse. And, I've gone and worked myself up into a frenzy now talking about Clapper, and I forgot where you started with the question. But powerful people should be subject to laws too. Absolutely. Could you ask the question again? Because I lost where I started with that. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was just asking you to speak on Tara Reade, and you gave your answer. She deserves to be heard. And
can I, though, just one piece to finish that? I just want to make this point to finish it around feminism, because it's not just Tara Reade, it's bigger than that. Reproductive liberty comes to mind as a really contested, crucial dimension of women's rights that Nancy Pelosi does not show up for. There have been 2 races this year in Illinois and Texas. I'm thinking of Marie Newman against Dan Lipinski in Illinois, and Jessica Cisneros, who was defeated by Henry Cuellar in Texas. And the only reason Henry Cuellar beat Jessica Cisneros was because Nancy Pelosi was stumping for and actively campaigning for a reproductive authoritarian. That is not a feminist position at all. It is a profoundly anti-feminist position. And anybody concerned with women's rights should recognize that and act accordingly. I am not just in favor of a woman's right to choose and control her own body. I also favor reproductive justice, which is the right of people who would be mothers to the resources they might need in order to have families, if that's a thing that they want to do. An entire generation right now is witnessing declining birth rates because young people don't have the economic viability to even have children, if that's something they're inclined towards. That also, the predatory system that keeps people from having kids if they want to have families, that's also not very feminist. The idea here that people can't have choices, that their choices are being made for them either by Henry Cuellar and Dan Lipinski with Nancy Pelosi's support, or by a market that doesn't allow them the resources to have, the opportunities that we might want in this life. In each of these arenas, I see Nancy Pelosi standing on the side of the very same institutions that would deny people, and women in particular, choices. And that is disqualifying as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. I digress a little bit. Something we didn't get to is climate justice. And you are in California, which, of course, so water is also going to be a big issue climate-wise for you as well. What are some of the main things of the Green New Deal that you support? And also, do you have any ideas of what we can do beyond that?
Thank you for bringing climate justice into the conversation. There are several parts of the Green New Deal that I'm especially excited about, and some other pieces beyond it to bring into the table. When I look at the vision that was articulated by Representative Ocasio-Cortez and the groups, including the Sunrise Movement, have emerged to support, one of the core elements of it that I think is a no-brainer that is increasingly recognized as an urgent imperative is to transition to 100% renewable energy. Now, getting there is going to require a lot of economic transition. And that's why the proposal is so visionary, because it's not just that. The Green New Deal also includes provisions for a just transition to bring along people who've worked in industries that might be impacted by that transition. So, for instance, if you work in West Virginia and you and your parents maybe worked in the mines, the Green New Deal envisions a pathway to a brighter, a different future that still has a place for you in it. Training and opportunities in the green economy. That just transition, I can't emphasize how important it is, because it is the political and policy lever that makes the visionary transformation of the economy and the Green New Deal possible. Another part of the Green New Deal that I very strongly support is the federal jobs guarantee. Here in California, just to think about what that looks like and one of the ways that can show up as being very helpful, we have catastrophic wildfires here every fall. And there's this boom bust hydrologic cycle. You mentioned the droughts. And in recent years, some of those wildfire seasons have been catastrophic, in dozens of deaths, which is to say climate chaos is already killing Californians. This is not a far off future fear. It is here and it is now. And one of the ways that we could mitigate the risk of disastrous wildfires is by practicing the very same forest management techniques that were long established by indigenous communities before the genocide. Why can't we do that? Because under a market system, there's no profit motive or property motive in performing that kind of ultimately public service. But a federal jobs guarantee could enable it. A federal jobs guarantee could put a generation of people in our nation's forests, replicating native land management techniques to ensure that in California, we don't have entire cities burning to the ground every year. That's just one example. When we look beyond the Green New Deal of things that we have to do to address climate justice, the very top of my list is dismantling the military-industrial complex. That's true not only to protect human rights in the face of sustained abuses like torture, but also to present opportunities for future generations to survive the climate crisis for two different reasons. One, the Pentagon is empirically our planet's largest single institutional source of carbon pollution. There is no enterprise on this earth that kicks more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So that's a very direct contribution to climate change. There is another one. Every one of our military interventions into foreign countries driven by plunder, effectively, whether that's the war for oil in Iraq or the 50-year Cold War for oil with Iran, or the coup for oil in Venezuela, or the coup for forests in Brazil, or the coup for lithium in Bolivia, just to complicate these matters, right? In each of these arenas, we see with the possible exception of Bolivia, since it's a lithium, and it presents a counterpoint that maybe is interesting to talk about, but just to finish the original point, one of the things that we are doing there is exacerbating and accelerating the climate crisis. And so we can't stop the climate crisis as long as we keep invading countries to steal their oil. So we have to both implement the Green New Deal, ensure a just transition, include the federal jobs guarantee to ensure the opportunity for labor-intensive projects, resiliency projects to happen, and we need to stop the Defense Department and CIA's international adventurism, keep fossil fuels in the ground, both here at home and abroad.
Absolutely. I'm so bummed. I can't believe it's been an hour already. Like, I feel like we haven't, we could keep going. I want you to give all your info, your website, your info for phone banking, everything. And also, I want you to give like a synopsis, a key takeaway for the viewers to recommend you or donate or something to take away from this show.
Thank you, sister. Folks can find us online at shahidforchange.us. We're also on each of the major social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, also Twitch and YouTube at Shahid for Change. You can sign up to volunteer at the website, or if you want a shorter link, shahid.fyi/volunteer or shahid.fyi/donate. We'll get you to the relevant pages. We'd love to have you. And again, are hosting training sessions very frequently. To your supporters or listeners in terms of how to present our campaign, I'd put it this way. All the marbles are at stake, right? If it weren't the pandemic, it is climate chaos. Our species is facing grave, grave risks. And our movement to put people at the center of our public policy, we might feel down at the moment with good reason. I can see why a lot of people might be disillusioned about the spectrum of alternatives available to us, particularly in the presidential race. But while we might be down, we are not out. And while we might not have options at the presidential level that we're excited by, we do have options in down ballot races. If you're not excited by my voice, at least recognize the constraint that Nancy Pelosi subjects the future to. So even if it's not a positive inspiration by someone who, I don't have Bernie's 50-year history of serving the public interest. I only have a 20-year history of serving the public interest, but I've fought battles when they were unpopular. And I'm eager to keep fighting those battles and to do it with a seat in Congress. I don't think we can settle for business as usual anymore. And it's not just Republicans that threaten our republic. It is absolutely corporate Democrats too. And if you're tired of performative opposition, if you're ready for resistance for real, if you're ready for universal health care and a right to shelter and housing and food, I'm eager to represent you in Washington.
Absolutely. And I don't like to vote shame, but if you guys live in his district and you don't vote for him, I don't want to hear you ever complain about Pelosi again, because we're counting on you, period. I'm in Pennsylvania and I'm counting on you all over this. Between this and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, you guys, you and Jen, we're counting on you guys. Like, this is a big, big deal. So thank you so much for coming back. I loved our discussion. You're amazing. I'm so happy how everything has been turning out for you. Thank you guys so much for watching as usual. Tomorrow night, I have the gentleman, Pat McGee. He's the one that did Bernie Blackout. So we're going to be having a great discussion. I have Luke Savage coming back on Friday. I have some other great shows in between. And then June 4th, I have Miss Angela Walker. She's the Green VP candidate for Howie Hawkins. So I have some really great shows coming up. Also, Pat the Burner / Nate's Liver and I are in the middle of writing book.
I love
so we're running parody on the resistance, and yes, the queen of the hour is in the book. Don't worry about it. Of course she is. So we'll be doing pre-orders next month when we officially release. But thank you again so much for watching, and thank you so much again, Shahid, and I wish you the best of luck with everything.
Thank you, Joy. I so appreciate you bringing me on. Great to be with you.